Hi, my name's Dave Newton, Principal at Regents Theological College. The video you're about to watch was taken from our Elim Theological Conference 2021, where we explored the theme of eschatology under the banner Mission Ready. I hope you enjoy it, I hope it challenges you and stirs your thinking. If you want to watch more of these videos, they're available on the Elim Pentecostal YouTube channel, or if you want to take your theology further, why not check out Regents Theological College at the website advertised below. Hope you enjoy, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Well, good morning. Within this talk then, I'll be talking about how eschatologies appear in the stories that our culture tells. I'm going to be suggesting some reasons as to why Christians should care about that, and I'll be leaving you with some questions to consider for your own contexts. So I hope you're ready to think about how the world ends. Now, for the most part, I'm going to be focusing on one kind of apocalypse, the zombie apocalypse. But partly to show what's so unusual about this particular phenomenon, I want to start somewhere different. Namely, I want to start with Game of Thrones. Because Game of Thrones is not only an incredibly popular TV show and a publishing phenomenon, but it also depicts a kind of apocalypse for its fictional world of Westeros. Now, the capital of Westeros is King's Landing. And in King's Landing, everything is political. Even the religion is manipulated by powerful people. Now, the idea of honor exists in Westeros. However, George R.R. Martin's vision deconstructs these expectations and shows that all of these ideas are just subsumed within a larger discourse of power. So in King's Landing, we have this very particular view of reality that may seem familiar to you. It's this really cynical world in which honor is just a fiction, and all claims to spiritual authority are nothing more than disguised plays for power. Even the notional authority figure, the king, is in fact bankrupt and in debt to the banks, and so capital and the invisible hand of the market are the real sources of power. However, as the books and the show goes on, we see King's Landing's secular confidence shaken because these zombie-like white walkers are advancing from the north, and dragons, long thought to be extinct, are approaching from the east. So the secular is menaced by the mythic, and civilization is threatened by a kind of supernature. Now, you may be asking yourself the question, so what? Who cares how a fictional world ends? But there are good reasons to care. Because as humans, we embody our fears and our desires in our stories. So if, as pastors and theologians, you want to take the cultural temperature, as it were, the stories we tell ourselves are a good place to start. Otherwise, there's a danger that we rush into the middle of a cultural conversation shouting, Jesus is the answer, only to be met with the quite reasonable objection that you haven't even really heard the question. So, in the case of Game of Thrones, it's not impossible to suggest that the return of the mythic speaks to our own late modern rejection of science and reason and perhaps even capitalism as meta-narratives. Certainly there are aspects of Game of Thrones that Christians might dislike, but this basic conception of their secular universe is more porous and unstable than had been thought really ought to open avenues for Christian engagement. In any case, Thrones' picture of the city encircled by the monstrous gives us a fairly archetypal depiction of how monster and apocalypse stories have tended to function in culture. Monsters are generally initially presumed to exist only at the margins, in the areas of the maps we haven't been to where we just write, "Here be dragons." But these stories, like Game of Thrones, reveal that order is often threatened and to some extent defined against chaos. We've tended to think of monsters as, in some sense, contradicting the natural order because they are creatures that somehow don't fit. You know, they're too big or they're too small, they have too many eyes or limbs, or they're hybrids of different creatures, or indeed they exist between categories. And by their exceptionalism, monsters, when they stop short of apocalypse at least, that is, when they threaten the world but don't destroy it, serve quite a valuable role as they help to establish the world. One of the ways that we can see what is normal is by seeing what is terribly abnormal. And for that, we need monsters at the margins. It's just that that is where we need them. And for as far back as we have stories or histories, we can see that people have divided our geographies, both literally in cartography and metaphorically in terms of areas of knowledge or experience, into these two conceptual territories. The known, which is ordered and often represented by the city, and the unknown, which is chaotic and outside the city. I'm drawing on a lot of Jordan Peterson's insights here, particularly from his book Maps of Meaning. So this is a kind of a model that stories propose for how we picture and organize our world. And you can see how they work in lots of different stories. So in Godzilla, for instance, we see that perhaps because of our own meddling and nuclear testing at the edges, perhaps exploring knowledge that is itself marginal, a monster arises from the sea and menaces the city. In Independence Day too, it's the aliens who come from space and they destroy initially icons of our civilization. It's the White House or it's Big Ben and so on. So in apocalypse stories, whether secular or religious, we generally see the end coming with the margins invading the center, or indeed the margins being removed entirely. So monsters come from the sea, aliens come from outer space, or the heavens are rolled up like a scroll. But there is one vision of apocalypse that is a little bit different. And because it's so different, I think it tells us something really particular and important about how late modern people are envisaging themselves and modern life. I'm talking about the zombie. Both The Walking Dead and 28 Days Later, two recent zombie productions, begin with the hero waking up in a hospital bed and discovering that the world as they knew it has already ended and their city is already overrun by zombies. They may have come from the margins, but they're already in the center. The next part of the story involves the hero discovering the rules of the monster. They go out into an apparently deserted city where they have their first encounters and narrow escapes. And because the cities are infected, they typically then leave the city to avoid contact and head out into the country, into the margins, where they'll discover that the other human survivors are just as dangerous as the zombies. And most unusually for monster stories, these tales frequently end not with the triumph of the hero, but with the last outpost being overrun. So the Gospel according to Zed says that the world ends not with the return of the Saviour, not with a judgment, but with a horde of creatures neither fully dead nor alive, incapable of making any judgment at all. It's this tidal wave of mindless consumption that will ultimately destroy us, and just possibly the zombies are already here. So what is the revelation of the zombie? Well, there are a couple of tropes that I've already touched on that I'd like to explore further. Firstly, let's look at how the zombies are encountered. They're first met when the hero wakes up. I don't think it's an accident that a monster that is mindless and that seeks to consume the brain of others needs for us to wake up, to gain consciousness in order to be perceived. And the hero often doesn't only wake up, but wakes up in a hospital after a brush with death. Now, hospitals are interesting places in that they are already marginal and they are the sites of combat between order and chaos. They're the places where the science and technology of Western medicine fights this forever losing battle against the forces of chaotic disease and death. So no wonder we clap for carers. They stand in the margins for us. So, the hero wakes up in a hospital on what might easily have been his deathbed. Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, in addressing what became the great sort of existential question of how to live authentically, describes this idea of being towards death as the appropriate posture to be adopted. We normally avoid thinking about death, and so does our culture. But Heidegger, along with the zombie film, places death's inevitability right in front of us. It seems to be important, the stories say, that I face the real situation, but in order to do it, I have to wake up. Now, facing death certainly provokes fear, but without that dread, we can't truly live at all. In fact, perhaps without that certainty that we will die and that we thus, in a sense, carry our deaths with us, we live only a kind of zombie unlife. It's a fairly familiar idea that we might gain insight into our lives on our deathbeds as our lives flash before our eyes. But what the zombie film seems to suggest is that we need to wake up now. We can spend our whole lives in meaninglessness. So after the brush with death, the hero wakes up and sees more clearly. Undeath for the zombie provides no revelation. And even if they did gain anything in the moments before reanimation, they couldn't communicate it because the zombie is without speech. Now, of course, symbols can be interpreted in many different ways, and the zombie certainly has been. However, the core characteristics of the monster are pretty stable across various iterations and across different media. So I hope that if I offer my interpretation, you can check it for coherence and utility against those other iterations. So as I've already implied, I believe that because zombies are mindless and are already everywhere, they stand in for our own fear that a mindless existence is not only possible, but if we don't somehow become conscious of the danger, likely to engulf us. Furthermore, the boundaries of order that we might normally imagine would protect us have, according to the story, already failed. They're already in the city. So this is one of the ways in which late moderns have chosen to envisage ourselves, or at least to represent what we fear we could become or could happen. And I think you can see why we would. It seems to me very possible to feed our lives into jobs that may have a very tangential relationship to reality, and then to anesthetize ourselves from the pain of that by seeking mindless diversion in our entertainment as well. Years can go by like that, maybe even whole lives. And in the absence of explanatory narratives, whether those provided by traditional religions or even the reason of the Enlightenment, where can we derive a sense of life being meaningful? So perhaps the secular apocalypse of the zombie is that of a society collapsing into meaninglessness. Now, the zombie apocalypse is a true macro eschatology regarding the end of the world, but it's also pertinent, I think, as a micro eschatology, as a metaphor for the end of my world or your world. One of the great sort of comic tricks of a film, Shaun of the Dead, that pulls is that our hero is commuting in London after the zombie apocalypse has happened, and he doesn't even notice it at first. He doesn't notice that everyone's a zombie because they look precisely as brain dead and semi-conscious as normal commuters. And he doesn't notice because he is, in a sense, already one of them. So the zombie is a symbol of us. But why is it that we should view ourselves in this way? Why should we look in the mirror and see a rotting face looking back at us? Why would we see ourselves as ugly? How has life become meaningless? And why do we see zombiehood as contagious? I think those are good questions, and they're quite important questions too. You know, you can see why we have problems with our mental health if we envisage ourselves in this way. Sadly, we don't have time to answer them here, but maybe we can look at just one of them. Why is zombiehood contagious? Zombies generally appear as a mass, but they're not unified because of shared feeling for one another. They're unified in an undifferentiated horde only because they have the same desire to consume, and they're driven entirely by this desire. Why would we see life like that? Well, possibly René Girard can help us to answer that, because Girard's big revelation was that desire is itself mimetic. And what he means by that is, I don't want things for the thing, I want them because I see that you want them. And this cycle of mimetic desire can become contagious. Now, if there's an infinite supply of the desired thing, then fine. But when the resource is scarce or can't be shared, then we start to get violent. And we actually lose sight of the thing that we wanted, and we focus entirely on our opponent, on our mimetic model. And ironically, the more we try to differentiate ourselves from our enemy, the more like them we become. And you can see that in all kinds of different phenomena. The zombies are consumed by desire. Their individuality has been lost to the horde. So both the end of the world and the end of your world can come when we mindlessly surrender to this. However, all is not lost. There are some seeds of hope even within the zombie mythos. The way that you kill a zombie, you should take a note of this, is with a headshot. To me, there's no logic to this. Of all monsters, zombies are the most mindless. So why should their minds be their vulnerability? Surely it would be more logical for it to be their bellies. Is it possible that the headshot stands as a metaphor that for revelation that arrives from outside of ourselves? Well, maybe. But as Christians, and perhaps here we find a point of contact between the horror story and our own, our revelation isn't really a doctrine, it's not an idea, it's a person. The bright light that turned Saul of Tarsus' world on its head was a person, and that person was meaning bearing. He was the word of God itself. And look what happens when the word of God meets us. In the Old Testament, we see that moral corruption is contagious, much like the contagion of the zombie. When an unclean person comes into contact with a clean one, that clean person becomes unclean. But Jesus reverses that. When Jesus, the most clean of all things, touched an unclean sinner, he's not contaminated. The sinner is cleansed. Zombies with their dying flesh are untouchables. They're like the lepers of Jesus' day. And Jesus didn't flee from lepers and he didn't fight them. He walks towards them and he made contact with them. In fact, if we read Jesus through the lens of the zombie story, then he begins to appear as a kind of anti-zombie. Because not only is his touch contagiously cleansing, but on the cross, he can, for a moment, be read as simultaneously both dead and alive. He still breathes, but the final nail has literally been hammered in, and nothing more is needed to kill him. He's as good as dead already. He bears all sin, that marker and bringer of death upon him. In Psalm 22, he's described in such a way that he appears simultaneously zombie-like and victim of the horde. Verses 14 to 17, all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax, it's melted within me. My mouth is dried up, my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death, all my bones are on display. He's a living corpse. And he feels the pull of meaninglessness. And we know that he was tempted in every way, just as we are, from Hebrews 4, 14 to 16. But even as he cries out, my God, why? He is, in fact, reaffirming meaning. Because he's quoting again from Psalm 22. He's pulling the feeling of isolation and despair and loss of meaning back into narrative, back into the divine story. And so even on the cross, he's dispensing life and meaning to those around him. Even on the cross, he is signaling his identity. The account of Gethsemane prepares the way for us. Here, Jesus prays earnestly that if possible, the cup of suffering should pass from him, yet he submits his fears and his desires beneath the semantic canopy of the Father's will. And this becomes the way for us, perhaps, to avoid zombiehood too. In Matthew 16, 24 to 25, Jesus says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. The opposite of the zombie is the one who denies their own desires, who willingly dies to them, and who, in surrendering their life, receives life in all of its fullness. So look at that. Perhaps Jesus was the answer after all. You can bring the zombie story into contact with yours, but you can only do it if you're prepared to walk through the scary narrative first. If you are, though, there may be some unique opportunities for evangelism. So some questions for you to consider as I finish. I've taken one aspect of the zombie, their contagious desire, and I've examined it in the light of a little theory. But what about all those other aspects? Zombies are ugly, they're homeless, without language, without thought, without community. That's probably enough to be going on with. So why does our culture see itself this way? Or at least why does it fear that this is something that it could easily become, or even something that could end the world? Thank you.